Welcome, one and all. I appreciate very much you turning out, and most especially the hospitality of our friends here at the Kirby Center of Hillsdale College in Washington. This is a special treat because we were only able to organize this at the very last moment to take advantage of our friend Andy McCarthy's visit to Washington this week, and I'm particularly grateful to Amanda Zan Irvin and Fred Grandy for being willing to roll with the punches and put something together that we envision being particularly useful for the larger audience who will get this via the videotape, as well as hopefully to the benefit of those of you who are in the room. My name is Frank Gaffney. I'm the president of the Center for Security Policy. This is an event that we've been wanting to do for some time, particularly for people in the community of folks in Washington who are concerned about public policy matters, because we think this is a public policy issue of the first order, with very significant implications for not just national security, but for our Constitution, for our form of government, for our way of life. And the "it" that I'm referring to is the effort by people who adhere to Sharia, a totalitarian political, military, legal program, to insinuate it into countries where it is not now the law of the land. It is an effort that has been underway for a long time, and what we're here to talk about is the extent to which that effort, under the sponsorship particularly of, I would argue, its most insistent, most aggressive, most skillful advocates, namely the Muslim Brotherhood, is actually now here in the United States. And we have a distinguished panel to speak about that issue. We'll start with Andy McCarthy, a former federal prosecutor, a man who has spent a lot of time both confronting and helping illuminate the nature of the Muslim Brotherhood, its operations in the United States, its efforts, along with others who seek the same goals, to use both violence, where that seems practicable, as in the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, which he prosecuted, or through more stealthy means, this agenda of insinuating Sharia here. He is the author of two terrific books addressing various aspects of this problem. The first, Willful Blindness, and the second, The Grand Jihad. I'm very proud that he was also a very important contributor to this book, Sharia, The Threat to America, volume we describe as a report of the Team B2. It tries to lay out in some detail some of the sources of this Sharia threat and how it is manifesting itself, and I hope he'll speak to that as well in the course of his remarks. He'll be joined by Amanda Zan Irvin, who is with the Alliance of Iranian Women. She is the founder of it and a champion of the rights of those women, but I think of women and other living things confronting the dangers of Sharia, both in Iran and elsewhere around the world, including here. And Amanda will give us some of her insights from within the faith as to the challenges that these sort of impulses represent. And finally, we'll have Fred Grandy, formerly a star of television, a member of Congress, the leader of Goodwill Industries, talk radio show personality here in Washington, and now I'm very happy to say a senior fellow at the Center for Security Policy, to talk about a very real-world aspect of the effort to impose Sharia, specifically Sharia blasphemy laws, inside the United States, one that he knows of firsthand, which he will speak to, I'm sure, in due course. So with that, let me again thank you all for coming. Thank you to those of you who are tuning in via video, and welcome to what I hope will be a very instructive program on the Muslim Brotherhood and the nature of its stealth jihad or civilization jihad, its targets and its successes to date. Over to you, Andy. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Frank. As Frank mentioned, I was a prosecutor in New York in the for a number of years, but when the terrorist threat came to our shores in 1993, and I think because Islamist ideology first presented itself to us in the form of terrorism, the immediacy of the threat, the horrific nature of it, the stakes of the horrific stakes of the terrorist attack have really clouded our view of what it is that actually fuels the terrorist threat, which is Islamist ideology. And as it turns out, as we studied this over the years, Islamist ideology not only is the motivating force for terrorism, but also for a broader civilizational threat. We use the term civilizational threat because we're borrowing from the Muslim Brotherhood. Frank mentioned that the name of my second book was The Grand Jihad. That wasn't something that I came up with. That's actually drawn from an internal 1991 Muslim Brotherhood memorandum from the Brotherhood's leadership in the U.S. reporting to the Brotherhood's global leadership in Egypt about how they saw their work in the West. And they basically describe it as a grand jihad aimed at eliminating and destroying Western civilization from within by sabotage. That's their words, not mine. What I think has happened is that because the threat first came to us as terrorism, and because we wanted to believe, just like I wanted to believe, just like everybody in the Justice Department, and frankly everybody in the United States, I think, wanted to believe in 1993, that what we were confronted by in terms of terrorism was a fringe group of I don't even want to call them radicals, I think we wanted to call them lunatics, who had perverted a doctrine and basically lied about what it said in order to justify terrorism attacks. And therefore, we divorced the possibility that there was any nexus between Islamist ideology and terrorism, because Islamist ideology is undeniably drawn from Islamic doctrine. Now, I should premise all this by saying there are a variety of different interpretations of Muslim doctrine. And as a non-Muslim, it's not my place to say what is the true Islam, or even if there is a true Islam. I also think that we waste a lot of our time in the West grappling with that question, which is certainly of academic curiosity, but in terms of our national security strategy is sort of beside the point. Whether the people who follow Islamist ideology represent, say, 65% of the world's 1.4 billion Muslims, or 35%, or something in between, something slightly lower, slightly higher, the point is, it is a mainstream ideology of Islam that is followed by, it's a construction of Islam that is followed by tens of millions of people. And that makes it a threat to us, whether it is the true Islam or not, whether it is representative of an accurate Islam or not. I'm not here to comment on or make a value judgment about its truth or falsity. My only concern is the national security of the United States. If they believe it, I need to deal with it. whether it's true or it's not true. We certainly, as a government, began in 1993 saying that what we had was an unrepresentative group that was committing horrific acts in the name of Islam, but we were quite insistent that they were not representative of any legitimate strain of Islam. And I guess when we started, I'm an Irish Catholic guy from the Bronx. I had about as much knowledge about Islam in 1993 as anybody with a reasonably good education in the United States, which is to say not a whole lot, just the headlines and not much else. So I had to delve into this just like everybody else did. And the immediate problem I had was, as the lead prosecutor in a big terrorism case, I had to get to the bottom of not only what people had done, but why they had done it. Because, unlike the politically correct things that are said in Washington and on the steps of a courthouse, in a courtroom where you have to prove a case to a jury, there's no political correctness. You actually have to level with them in a frank way about why people did what they did. Otherwise, normal people will not convict people of very serious crimes. The troubling thing to us, and I can give you two examples which really changed my thinking about this. One was that the blind sheikh, who was the leader of the terrorist cell that formed in New York in the late 80s and early 90s, we always had some concern, as you have in any criminal trial, that the lead defendant will testify. So it turned out that he didn't testify, but that didn't mean that I didn't have to get ready for him. So what we thought was, and certainly what I thought was, if what we're saying as a government is true, if these guys are lying about the ideology, I'm not stupid enough to think that with my background I could get into a theology debate with a doctor of Islamic jurisprudence graduated from Al-Azhar University. But I did think that if what we were saying was true, there had to be 3 or 4 places that I could nail them, where I could say, you say the doctrine says this, but actually the doctrine says that. So we went to work on the blind sheikh, who is a very prolific speaker and writer, and scrubbed his books, scrubbed his speeches, scrubbed his sermons, scrubbed everything we had on him. And the problem we encountered was every place he said the doctrine says this, he wasn't lying. It actually said what he said it said. Now, to be fair, the doctrine also says a lot of other things, and you could make a criticism, I think, and people do make this criticism in good faith, that a number of the things that the doctrine also says need to be considered with the things he was quoting so that you get a more accurate context of it. Over the years, I've found that to be a less and less persuasive criticism. But my more narrow point is that what we were saying was not true. You could say that there are other provisions of Islamic doctrine that would soften some of the bellicose things that he said, but what you couldn't say was that what he was drawing on was not in there. It was. So that was one major revelation. And then the other one was, because we had such a long trial, it was a 10-month trial, or almost 10 months, we ended up having an extraordinarily long defense case, actually a longer defense case than most federal criminal trials take. And in the course of it, a number of Muslim people, authentically moderate Muslim people, came in to testify on behalf of various of the defendants. And I want to be clear about this. These were authentically moderate Muslim people. They would no more be involved in a terrorism attack than any of us in this room would. But in the course of that, every now and then, while they were being asked questions by the lawyers, some point of Islamic theory, Islamic ideology, Islamic doctrine would come up. And on at least 3 occasions, these perfectly moderate people who were sitting in the witness box, when they were asked a question like, what does jihad mean? Or some doctrine question like that, would say, I wouldn't be qualified to answer that question. You'd have to talk to somebody like him, and they would proceed to point to the homicidal maniac who was sitting in the corner of my courtroom as the lead defendant. Now, this didn't mean that any of them would commit terrorism because the sheikh ordered them to commit terrorism, but it did strike me that you had these perfectly moderate, decent, good people who would actually turn to someone like Sheikh Abdul Rahman as an authority figure on points of doctrine in their own belief system, and I found that to be frightening. And as you get more into this, you then have to think about a few other things. The blind sheikh, blind from about the age of 4, has every malady known to man. Bad ticker, diabetes, you name it, he's got it. He is of no use, ostensibly, to a terrorist organization. Can't build a bomb, can't carry out an attack, can't do an assassination, nothing like that. So how does he end up being the boss? How does he end up being the visionary? He ends up being that way because he is a renowned authority, a jurisprudent on Sharia, which is the key doctrine. That's the sole and only authority that he has over a terrorist organization. And yet, he not only conducted the attacks or navigated the attack, orchestrated the attacks of the early 90s, Osama bin Laden has credited him with being the person who issued the fatwa, the Islamic edict that justified the 9/11 attacks. I stress this to you because I think we have to come to grips with the fact that ideology and the authority over ideology is the galvanizing force in this entire movement, which is not just a terrorist movement. It sees itself as a grassroots uprising, a mass movement to try to further Sharia. Speaking of which, we threw the word jihad around fairly liberally in the cases in the 90s. We continue to throw it around today. But it seems when given the variety of things you hear about it, that we, even at this stage, 18 years after the Trade Center attack, a decade after 9/11, we still really don't know what jihad is. So some people on my side of the debate will tell you that jihad is always and everywhere about combat. It's always about violence. It's not about anything but violence. It's a military mission to further Islam. And then there are other people on the other side who are either Islamists themselves or apologists or even people in the intelligence community, people in the administration, who will tell you that no, that's an antiquated concept. Jihad is really the internal struggle to become a better person. And if you listen to them long enough, you'd start to think that jihad is something along the lines of remembering to brush after every meal. It's not any more threatening than that. Neither side has it completely accurate. Jihad is always and everywhere about the implementation and spreading of Sharia. In Islamic ideology, Sharia is deemed to be the necessary precondition to Islamicizing a society. You'll often hear people in the apologist camp say, look at what it says in the Quran. There can't be any compulsion in Islam. They won't force you to become a Muslim. They won't coerce you into accepting their religion. Well, that's true, but you need to look at the fine print. They will coerce you into accepting Sharia, which has very strict conditions about how non-Muslims are to live under the authority of the Islamic State. That's the way they're able to look you in the eye and say they're not going to force you to convert. Sharia doesn't force you to convert. It allows you to live as a non-Muslim under the authority of a Muslim state. But you have to be humiliated, because it says in the Quran that you have to feel yourself subdued, and you have to pay a tax. And you have to live under some very other adhesive conditions. And if you don't accept that, then you're in a state of war, and then your choice is either war or death. So that is what Sharia is about. When I say jihad is always about spreading Sharia, if you're under circumstances where it needs to be spread through violence, it will be spread through violence. If you're in a situation where the other side is ceding territory or ceding issues without the need for violence, they don't resort to violence. But the point is that it's always about trying to plant Sharia, because the mission ultimately is to Islamicize societies. And without that fundamental of Sharia, there is no hope of taking the next step of Islamicizing the society. So, when the people who talk about a military mission say what they say, they're quite right to say that jihad originally grew up as a violent concept. Islam was mostly spread by the sword, not by peaceful persuasion. But when you listen to the other side of the argument, when you listen to the apologists say internal struggle to become a better person, or the other thing they'll say in a collective way is a community struggle to rid itself of bad influences, you need to parse that in an Islamic sense. They don't really mean the internal struggle to become a better person. What they mean is the internal struggle to become a better Muslim, which means a better, more Sharia-compliant Muslim. That is not an objective, universal value concept. It's a strictly Islamic concept. When they talk about a neighborhood ridding itself of bad influences, what they mean is a neighborhood or a community ridding itself of non-Muslim influences. In other words, it's the individual duty and the collective duty to become a better, more Sharia-compliant Muslim, which is a very, very different concept. I mean, we'd love to think that we all have the same values and that we're all one common humanity and we all have the same ideas about what it means to be a better person or have a community that's rid of evil influences, but the fact is we don't see it all the same way. This is all a preface to trying to draw a distinction for you between flat-out terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, like the Blind Sheikh's cell, and the broader threat that we're dealing with from the Muslim Brotherhood. An organization like Al-Qaeda is just a flat-out, blunt, extortionate terrorist organization. They want to bludgeon you into accepting Sharia. And they have a serious philosophical difference with the Muslim Brotherhood. They will not sit down and negotiate with any state or any government that is a target of their aggression, because they believe that the very act of sitting down and negotiating actually legitimizes the non-Muslim enemy, and that's something that's unacceptable to them, so they won't do it. The Muslim Brotherhood, which began in Egypt in the 1920s, and was started by a very sophisticated, charismatic fellow by the name of Hassan al-Banna, has a very different approach, and it's a much more sophisticated approach. To the Muslim Brotherhood, terrorism is just one item on a very variegated menu. They will use anything at their disposal that advances the mission of implementing and spreading Sharia. They will also and be quite happy to not only sit down and negotiate with government, they actually want to bore inside of government, because being inside, having your hands on the wheel, actually does more to advance the mission than anything else does. One good way to understand what you're dealing with is to take Sheikh Yusuf Qaradawi, who is probably the most influential Sunni cleric in the world, the leading jurisprudent of the Muslim Brotherhood. Right after the 9/11 attacks, Sheikh Qaradawi condemned the 9/11 attacks. And everybody, of course, went up in a balloon, because he's a well-known Muslim Brotherhood figure, and he's condemning the 9/11 attacks, and they say, how moderate, how wonderful, he's on our side. And then, a couple of years later, he issued a fatwa calling for the killing of American troops in Iraq. So you scratch your head and say, how do we resolve this contradiction? Well, it wouldn't be a difficult contradiction to resolve if we actually studied the ideology that we're dealing with. Iraq is a Muslim country. Under Sharia, Islamic law, it is the obligation of Muslims to drive out any non-Muslim forces that invade or occupy a Muslim country. And if terrorism is the only way available to do that, your obligation is terrorism. And that's the way it is. He was simply following Sharia. On the other hand, in the United States, we're not a Muslim country, so there's no obligation to attack us. It becomes a cost-benefit analysis. If you take a look at what's going on in the United States, from the Muslim Brotherhood's perspective, they've got it pretty good here. They're doing a fabulous fundraising operation. They have managed to get millions of dollars for Hamas, for example, which actually is the Muslim Brotherhood's Palestinian branch. That's not me saying so, that's in their charter. They do great fundraising here. They're able to meet and plan here in a way that they wouldn't be able to in a lot of Islamic countries, particularly ones that are under authoritarian regimes that have banned the Brotherhood. They are able to pursue, because of our First Amendment, their agenda of trying to advance Sharia and implement it in our institutions, in our education system, in our legal system, where we now have, for example, a thriving Sharia finance industry in the United States. So from Sheikh Qaradawi's perspective, we have the movement has a lot of assets that it's deriving in the United States, and on the other side of the ledger, by attacking us, 2 Muslim countries were invaded and occupied, and all of the activities of the Islamist groups in the United States came under heightened scrutiny, which they hadn't had prior to 9/11. So on their cost-benefit analysis, it was a negative, and that was the reason that he condemned it. But understand, as I said, Hamas is the Muslim Brotherhood in the Palestinian territories. They don't have a moral problem with terrorism. It's not that 9/11 was a morally wrong act as far as they're concerned. It was a counterproductive act. They will use terrorism where it advances the cause, and they will reject terrorism where the net effect of it is a negative for them. But we shouldn't be under any illusions. They have a campaign here which they're trying to carry out to spread Sharia through our institutions. They're willing in a non-Muslim country always to do it in an incremental strategy. If you don't think it can work here, just take a look at what's going on in Europe, because they said 10 years ago it wouldn't work there either. And the last point I want to make, because I realize I've already gone beyond my time, is the new argument that we're hearing is basically that there's no such thing as Sharia. It sort of reminds me of, 10 years ago there was no such thing as Jihad. Now there's no such thing as Sharia, because there are multiple different interpretations of it. I think there's multiple different interpretations of it, the same way some of us lapsed Catholics might say there's multiple different interpretations of Catholicism. There actually is a doctrine of Catholicism, but some of us don't follow all of it. And I'm not saying that as something to be proud of. I'm just making a statement of fact. But when you don't follow a provision, that doesn't mean that the doctrine doesn't exist anymore. It just means that you have a rather eccentric way of following. Sharia has different interpretations, but the claim that it's not knowable or that it doesn't exist is preposterous. And that's why I brought along my one prop that I have here. This is a book that's available on Amazon. Anybody can get it. It's called Reliance of the Traveler. It is the ancient manual of Islamic law, of Sharia. And it calls itself the classic manual of Islamic sacred law. This is not a crackpot book. This is not, it has some provisions that we might regard as crackpot, but what I mean is it's not put out by a crackpot outfit. The English version of it that's circulated in the United States comes from the government of Saudi Arabia. If you open the beginning of it, it has a variety of different endorsements. And those endorsements come from a number of Muslim governments. It is also endorsed by Al-Azhar University. Al-Azhar University is the seat of Islamic learning for, basically since the 9th or 10th century. When we talk about some of these influential figures, like the blind sheikh, like Qaradawi, like some of these other famous Islamic jurisprudence, they're generally speaking graduated out of Al-Azhar University. It would be, if there was a Muslim Vatican, it would be Al-Azhar University. And the other thing is, it's got an endorsement also from the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which happens to be a Muslim Brotherhood tentacle in the United States, formed by Muslim Brotherhood figures in the 1980s. It's probably one of the most important, influential Brotherhood entities that we deal with. And if you go through this book, it says what we say it says about Sharia. It says that jihad is a military mission to advance Islam. It indicates that apostasy is a capital offense. Homosexuality is a capital offense. Women have half the inheritance rights of men. Their testimony is worth half in court that of a man. It indicates that anything that sows discord among the Ummah, the worldwide Muslim community, is deemed to be apostasy, which, as I mentioned, is a capital offense. And truth is not a defense. So if you say things that put Islam in a bad light, or put the Prophet in a bad light, or do anything that would create divisions of opinion among Muslims, that is deemed to be a very serious offense, which under Sharia would be handled in a very severe way. So my only point to you in bringing this out is it gets a little tiresome after a while to be accused of making all this stuff up, but this is knowable, it's accessible, it exists, it is propagated by people who are deemed to be, and institutions and governments that are deemed to be legitimate, and it's real, and it's what they're trying to accomplish. Thank you.
Andy, thank you. A characteristically brilliant exposition of the magnitude of the problem. I want to just mention one point that I think you overlooked in your quick rendering of the Muslim Brotherhood's strategic plan, which is featured in this book, which is also available at Amazon. We have a couple of copies here if you don't have it, the Team B report, as not only a mission, Grand Jihad, to eliminate and destroy Western civilization, but to do it by our hands. So part of what we wanted to discuss with you today is the extent to which this is indeed happening inside the United States and how. And one of the people who's been watching this closely, who's been campaigning against it, and who brings an authority by virtue of her own background in Islam and from Iran, is Manda Zand-Irvin. So Manda, thank you very much for joining us.
Something in a hurry yesterday, but I think I'm going to complete what was said. One of the issues about Islam, if you look at the history of Islam, which in my country when I went to school and I read the history, is Islam spread by sword, not by convincing people to convert. When you read books, history books in Iran, it tells you how the Arabs came from peninsula, how they built towers of people's heads, and how they looted, and how they took, and how they tore everything down and set fire on everything, and how the purpose was to eliminate the culture that was there. Even the language was forbidden after that to be spoken, and they forced Arabic language to the people who've been invaded by the Arabs from Peninsula. Before the Arabs from Peninsula in 6th century came, there were great civilizations lived in the area, and in North Africa, in Middle East, my own country, Persia, was a great civilization. But when Arabs came and spread Islam And not only, I'm going to be very politically incorrect, not only Islamization, but Arabization of the Middle East and North Africa, and they went as far as Europe, but they didn't succeed. Their purpose was to eliminate what was there, to force the people to accept the Arab culture and the Arab religion, Islam. It took 200 years for my people, for Iranians, to stop speaking Arabic and stop bringing back their own Persian language. Not only they looted and they took and killed and took boys to slavery and girls to slavery, they forced people to pay homage, and they forced them to, they called them the lower class. In Arabic, they called the invaded lands ajams, which means the stutterers, because the other people couldn't speak Arabic. Arabic was not their language, but when they forced to speak, they had accents in speaking, so they called them ajam. In Arabic means stutterers, and they were looked down upon because they were not Arabs. And they promoted and taught people that Arab race is the supreme race. The only reason is that Muhammad was given to them, to the Arabs from Peninsula, which are called the Najdi Arabs. And because Muhammad is considered in Islam the last prophet of God to man, therefore, and Allah selected the Arab from Peninsula, the Najd Arabs, to be given Muhammad to. Therefore, the Arabs are the supreme race, and therefore everybody else was non-supreme or the second-class citizen anywhere else. They treated everybody, the policy of the caliphate, from the Prophet himself all the way after him, the caliphates, was to take over the world by the sword, not only the Islam as a religion, but Islam as everything that a human needs. Islam is economics, Islam is social laws, Islam is political laws, Islam is your government, Islam ummah. Ummah in Arabic means the mother, the owner. And Islam, the word is taslim, comes from taslim, means total surrender. Therefore, a human, a Muslim is not a human, has no will of himself or herself. Well, her is second class nothing, but himself does not exist because it's total surrender as an ummah to a religion. Therefore, loyalty to a land, to a home, to a government, to a citizenship is illegal and is a huge sin. You cannot love your country. You will be punished if you love your country. You have your own, your country is Islam, your home is Islam, your family is Islam, everything that you are is Islam. Therefore, if you love your country, if loyalty to your country, you're a sinner. That's why here in America, when I see the people do not understand, really grasp the root cause of the fact that our democracy, our freedom, our words that has been created, diversity, or political correctness, all of this stuff is hitting back at us. They have become a tool for the Muslim Brotherhood, for Islamists, to take our freedom, to take our culture, to take the 21st century and bring the 6th century of the Peninsula, Najd Arab culture into America. And that, unfortunately, it's very difficult for everybody to understand, to accept that it is a fact. I know it because I went through it in Iran 30 years ago. Iranian people, we were laughing at Khomeinism. I said, are you kidding me? 3,000 years, we've never had religion ruling the country. We joked at it. And many of our media, members of the media, the academia, and intellectuals went along with Khomeini ideology. And what happened? Khomeini did take over, Islamism did take over Iran, and Iran is now in poverty. So I have been through it, and I know what this is beginning. It's starting here in America. It has started for a long time. And sometimes I jokingly say, they followed me here. I ran away from them to America. I thought you can't go any farther than this, but they followed me here to America. One of the issues about the blind mullahs and all these things in Islam, they have a position called ulama. Ulama is the person, the know-it-all, is actually the literally translation of ulama. Ulama means the person who can tell people what to do. And if ulama tells you this is what Sharia says, that's what Sharia says, because the ulama has told you. And so fatwas come from the ulamas. And jihad comes from ulamas. Again, in the Arabic world, they say jihad comes from jahd. Jahd has a meaning to try. This is what I have heard. They are saying a lot of the people who want to not see the facts and the issues. They say, well, it means, jahd means to try. There's nothing wrong with that. Well, it depends on how you translate the jahd and where you put it and how you use it. Jihad has been used from day one by the Islamic military, when they took all over the Middle East and North Africa, went all the way to Spain. It was used jihad. That was what they were doing, jihad. They were fighting to spread Islam, and they were fighting to remove everything from the culture of every nation and every tribe at those times, remove them and replace them with the Islamic culture. And that's what they did, and that's what they want to do. That's the goal, is to, one step at a time. Now they can't have the military and the sword, and they said the two-edged sword. Now they are using the American freedom, democracy, and the issues that we have used to respect humanity. They are using all of those against this culture to eliminate humanity from our culture. That's what they are doing. Also, well, I guess I talked about all of the issues that I have put here.
That's a good place to stop.
Yes.
Great. Amanda, thank you so much. And, one of those who has experienced this firsthand, as I mentioned, is our next speaker, Fred Grandy. I'll let him tell you the story of how he came to confront this and give you some thoughts about the peril that it represents for all of us. Fred.
For those of you who do not know, until March of this year, I had a radio show here in Washington on WMAL, a morning show. And for about the last 12 to 15 months, my show featured, not to the exclusion of everything else, but along with myself and my wife, and by the way, every member of this panel who has appeared on our show at some point, began to talk a little bit about the Muslim Brotherhood, stealth jihad, and the war within the information battle space that parallels the kinetic wars that we're fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. And this, I want to stress, went on without criticism or pushback for about 15 months. It culminated in a large public forum at the Capitol Visitor Center right over here on Capitol Hill that had eminent scholars from the Heritage Foundation and the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and other contributors to our show, foreign policy experts, all talking to some degree about this. And the response was very enthusiastic. Shortly after that, the managers, the general managers and the operation directors of our show pulled me into their office and said, we want you to stop doing this. And I said, there seems to be an appetite for this particular subject, and besides, we're only doing it for a segment or two a week on a show that ran 20 hours a week. And so my wife and I, knowing that we had been perhaps warned, went forward, and the upshot was they pulled me back into the office again and said, we're firing your wife, but you can stay. At that point, I told them what they could do. And I guess to think of myself as a casualty to this is to, of course, remind you that if you do a morning show, you usually have to go to bed at 6 p.m. so you can get up at 1:30. This is a lifestyle that morning radio hosts share with dairy farmers and vampires. So let me just say at the outset, and I do not know, but if the Muslim Brotherhood or their affiliate organizations in this country and elsewhere were involved in pulling me off the air, let me just say thank you. My life has returned to normal, and now I can work full-time on what I did part-time on the radio. And what I want to do in my piece of this is, Amanda has given you kind of the ancient history of the spread of Islam, and Andy has given you some of the more immediate history, but I want to talk, to use the title of one of Andy's book, about the willful blindness that exists right now among prevailing government organizations in dealing with assessing this enemy threat doctrine, which I think it's fair to say is masquerading as a religion and an ideology, but has another agenda, even though you couldn't tell it from anybody in the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, Justice, or State. And let me begin by trotting out some of the usual suspects that you know. Nidal Hassan, the Fort Hood shooter, his copycat, Nasser Abdo, Faisal Shahzad, the Times Square bomber, of course Anwar al-Awlaki, who was to some degree the eminence grise for a lot of these guys, and himself a terrorist. Carlos Bledsoe, also known as Abdul Hakim, the Little Rock shooter, and the newest member is this fellow from Massachusetts, Azwan Fardous, who is supposedly responsible for the alleged drone attack on the Pentagon. Every one of these individuals announced and continued to affirm that they were soldiers of Allah, that they were involved in a struggle that was larger than them, and they were self-declared jihadists without provocation. Faisal Shahzad, when he was hauled in front of a district judge, said, I am just the little droplet of a huge wave to come. And every one of these individuals essentially was following what they believed to be the strict adherence to Islamic doctrine, which is to announce what you are going to do to give your enemies full warning. And Nidal Hassan, no less than 23 times, announced to his superiors that if you force me to fight against my Muslim brothers, I will turn and fire on American soldiers, which is exactly what he did. And yet, to this day, whether we're looking at Department of Defense analysis or Department of Justice analysis, there is still no mention that there was any religious or ideological basis for these recurring acts of violence. That really, I think, stretches the imagination to believe this, particularly when we know now that these individuals were really, at least in their minds, soldiers of Allah and fulfilling their responsibilities as mujahideen. I couldn't help thinking when Andy was talking about the International Institute of Islamic Thought, which is based right here in Northern Virginia, along with most of the predominant Muslim Brotherhood institutions, that one of the first people to go to Fort Hood in the aftermath of Nida al-Hassan to talk to the troops and the families was Louis Safi, who is affiliated with the International Islamic Institute of Thought and is himself supposedly part of what is arguably a Muslim Brotherhood institution. So not only are we allowing perhaps this kind of ideology to penetrate, but we are also turning to some of these individuals for care and comfort. Which brings me to a more recent event, which I think is just as troubling. The Department of Homeland Security has recently put out a white paper, the title of which is a little longer than this, but essentially says it is empowering local partners to deal with violent extremism in their communities. It is supposedly a working paper on how to deal with terrorism, although that word is very rarely mentioned, and in terms of Islamic fundamentalism or jihad or any of the terms, those hardly appear at all, and for good reason. This paper essentially says that what you must not do is use any kind of religious underpinning or ideology in dealing with these kinds of attacks. It provides no presiding federal authority, not the Department of Homeland Security, not the Department of Justice, not anything in between, to look over this entire spectrum of violence. By the way, something that has drawn the criticism of both chairs of the House and Senate Homeland Security Committees, Joe Lieberman and Peter King. And it also says pretty definitively that if there is a conflict in your community between law enforcement and what they're trying to do and community outreach and what they're trying to do, you should always come down on the side of community outreach. Going back to what Andy was talking about with the arrest and successful prosecution of the blind sheikh, it's hard to conceive how Raymond Kelly, the police commissioner of New York, could have even arrested, captured, and brought to trial the blind sheikh had he been forced to live under these kinds of guidelines that are now being promulgated to deal with terrorism right now. These are the kinds of things that are now, I think, if not affecting our policies yet in a large way, or our legal system, certainly are beginning to change our culture. And as Frank said, I think beginning to compromise what we've always presumed are kind of First Amendment rights, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, due process. And so this is what I think is the most important aspect of this, is our opponents have forced us to use a vernacular that they have created themselves. We are not allowed to use the terms that effectively define the enemy because they are politically incorrect. They have no such problem in defining us. And I want to end with this particular note, because in addition to the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice, Department of Defense, another place I think we have to look now is the State Department, not just internationally, but here at home as well. As it so happened yesterday, I began my day by attending a seminar at the Hudson Institute on the slaughter of Coptic Christians in Egypt, and particularly the massacre that took place on October 9th. And three eminent scholars talking effectively but dispassionately about this tragedy, and of course alluding to the growing political power of the Muslim Brotherhood and their affiliate organizations in Egypt. And like so many of these kind of multisyllabic think tank confabs, it described the problem without really getting into the horror of it. But the conclusion was that there was no situation that will emerge from whatever government Egypt decides upon that will provide any kind of scenario of hope for the 10 million or so Coptic Christians that are trying to survive in Egypt under this new government. This, of course, is the same kind of Muslim Brotherhood that the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, said is largely a secular organization last spring when he testified in front of the House Intelligence Committee, as if they were the equivalent of the Kiwanis Club of Greater Cairo. Shortly after that, David Reboy, my colleague at the center, and I happened to walk up Pennsylvania Avenue and get involved in the protest march by the Coptic Christians who had come to this town to protest what is going on with them. And really, without trying, we got swept up into what their argument is. And we're talking about a group that represents maybe 500,000 people in the United States. And what so many of them said to us, I think, is something that we need to take away right now. These are American citizens who are paying taxes to the United States government, which are turning around and in some cases giving those taxes back to sustain military aid in Egypt, which is aiding and abetting this slaughter, and at the very least standing by and allowing it to happen. That is something that is largely missing when you look at the Washington Post this morning, which has a nice picture of what went on, but the story is on B3. In other words, this is a metro section story. This is something that's happening in the District of Columbia, and the story itself doesn't go anywhere near talking about what is happening to this group in Egypt under Sharia law. They are second-class citizens. To some degree, they've made their peace with that. One of the problems that they're encountering right now is they're trying to rebuild their churches, and under strict Sharia, that is not allowed. They've acquiesced already and said, all right, we won't put crosses outside the church. If you insist, we won't have domes. But even accommodating those concerns is not enough, apparently, under what looks to be the new regime. So after spending about an hour with these folks and hearing firsthand how they as American citizens are terribly afraid, not just of what will happen to their relatives in Egypt, but what is happening in this country with the Muslim Brotherhood and organizations that are trying to at least insinuate these kinds of Islamophobic preconditions into how we deal with threats, was a real eye-opener. But I want to just end with what happened when I got back to my office, because we received a story about a conference that had taken place at George Washington Law School on Tuesday, which was, I believe it's described as a 9/11 discrimination conference put on by the Department of Justice and featuring some pretty eminent people like Tom Perez, who's head of the Civil Rights Division, and most specifically Dwight C. Holton, who is a former U.S. attorney and current senior litigation authority. And what they were trying to do was once again parse out the threat to make sure that whenever we dealt with a terrorist, religion never was part of that evaluation. And this is what Holton said. This is a quote. I want to be perfectly clear about this. Training materials that portray Islam as a religion of violence or with a tendency towards violence are wrong, they are offensive, and they are contrary to everything that this President, this Attorney General, and Department of Justice stands for. They will not be tolerated. And that, I think, now is a prevailing ethic, certainly within the Department of Justice and maybe across the entire administration. I'm drawing this from an article that was put together by Diana West, who is another person that we have engaged to talk about this and is very much an authority. And she counters this argument with a quote from Abu Qatada, who is a well-known person in the Islamic movement, referred to as Osama bin Laden's spiritual guide. And this is what he says: "I am astonished by President Bush when he claims there is nothing in the Quran that justifies jihad or violence in the name of Islam. Is he some kind of Islamic scholar? Has he never actually read the Quran?" Now, what we're dealing with are people like Dwight Holton and Eric Holder and Thomas Perez saying all of this stuff about Islam is a false negative. If that's true, the book that Andy just put his hand on is a false negative. And so is the Quran. And this is the disconnect that we are trying to deal with right now. And I have to tell you that obviously I've been involved in this for some time. But if you just spend a little bit of time talking with American citizens who are Coptic Christians and dealing today and probably going forward with the imminent, if not demise, certainly diminution of their population in their home country, and perhaps the marginalization of them in this country along with the rest of us, it is very much an eye-opening event and something I hope we start paying more attention to. And I will yield back the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Congressman. Just one quick observation before we open it up to your questions and comments. The reporting that is taking place now about the Department of Justice's attitude towards not tolerating this kind of training, this kind of information being disseminated within the government goes on to describe, in, I think, Dwight Holton's words, the Attorney General of the United States announcing that there will be what amounts to, it sounds like, a kind of reprogramming to take place if they find people who have actually received, as part of their employment in the government, training that makes any of the points that the panel has made here today. Points documented by authoritative texts, points that illuminate and are confirmed by the practitioners of Sharia. So we're at a moment when information dominance, as the military calls it, is very much being practiced as part of the stealth jihad. And this panel, and I hope further conversations that flow from it, will be an important contributor, as Andy's books have been, as Sharia, the Threat to America is, as Amanda's great work is, as the work that Fred is about is, to counteract the efforts by our enemies, among other things, to impose Sharia blasphemy laws here, and thereby dominate our understanding of the threat and prevent us from being able to counteract it. So again, with the greatest of appreciation to those on the panel and to those of you here and to those of you watching the video for helping engage in this kind of conversation, which we must have if we are to survive the civilization jihad that the Brotherhood is waging against us. So with that, let me open up the floor. Ken Timmerman.
My question is for Andy McCarthy, and you may have addressed this, Andy, in your remarks earlier. I apologize for getting here a little bit late. But I would like to hear your comments to what Fred Grandy just said and Frank just said about the reprogramming by the Department of Justice of individuals in law enforcement who may have gotten this kind of training. How, from your point of view as a former federal prosecutor, how will this affect the FBI's investigation of potential radical jihadi networks here in this country, of them reopening the Green Quest investigation into Islamic jihadi funding of these networks? Could you kind of go into that a bit and describe, from your point of view as a former prosecutor, what it would mean? Thank you.
Well, Ken, my first reaction when I heard about this morning, which I actually hadn't heard about till I came in the door, was to sort of shrug my shoulders and say, well, you know, if Eric is willing to undergo maybe a pardon process reprogramming, I might be willing to do a Sharia reprogramming. Maybe we can do that sort of a swap. You know, look, it's a brushback pitch by people who are at the policy end of the government. It's obviously going to have an interorum effect on the levels down. Now, understand, and I think we need to understand this, that there are very dedicated, committed agents, prosecutors, and others in the field offices, also in Main Justice throughout the United States, who got into law enforcement because they're patriotic Americans, and they're not going to turn their brains off because somebody told them that it was not a good career move to try to see straight. And they will still be effective, and they will still do what they can do within the constraints that are imposed on them, what they can do to protect the United States. But to the extent that investigations happen, and to the extent that agents are free to pursue the logical leads that come across to them, you can be assured that there is going to be a paralysis in any in the totality of investigative activity. When the signal gets sent from Main Justice, and particularly if it is echoed in the FBI, that these organizations are to be deemed, for example, to be engaged in First Amendment protected activity, and that we are no longer going to treat them as seditious in any way or provocative in any way, you're not going to have the collection of investigative leads. You're not going to have progress in trying to understand what they do. And frankly, we've seen the wages of that. I mean, this is how Fort Hood ends up happening. You have screaming signals of suspicious activity. You look the other way because it's become politically correct to look the other way, and bad things start to happen. Now, that's on the violence end of it, and frankly, the violence end of it is what the FBI and the Justice Department are most concerned about. You know, look, you don't want the FBI policing the information battle space here. My own view of that is that we need to let America work, which is to say we need to honor our First Amendment principles and values and allow them to make their case, but allow us to make our case and make it in the light of day, and then let the American people decide. That's the right way to do things. I don't want the Justice Department and the FBI involved in policing what people think and what people should think about Islam. I don't think it's any of their business, frankly. They've got enough of a hard job to do to protect us from terrorist attacks. But what I think I object to the most, and what we all ought to object to the most, is the FBI and the Justice Department lending the considerable cachet and prestige that they have to Islamist organizations that don't have the best interests of the United States at stake. And to the extent that what we want, and what we've said for a couple of decades now that we want in the Islamist world, is reform and moderation, what you're doing is empowering the worst elements of the American Islamic community, which is the leadership elements that have ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, and you're selling out the rank and file American Muslims. And I must tell you that it came to my attention while we were investigating this in the 90s, I think it's only been confirmed again and again and again since then, that there is a dramatic divide in the United States between the leadership of the mosques and the Islamic community centers and the rank and file American Muslims. In my experience, at least, rank and file American Muslims tended to be patriotic and pro-American. This is it's all an oversimplification. You know, obviously there's shades of gray. But they were actually quite willing to help us in our investigations. And if we hadn't had their assistance, we wouldn't have been able to infiltrate terrorist organizations and thwart terrorist attacks and whip translations into shape so that we could show a compelling case to a jury. Without the help of those people, we couldn't have done what we were able to accomplish. But if you study Brotherhood ideology, Bana, who was, as I said in my remarks, is a very sophisticated guy who had a very thoughtful program. It was a ground-up revolution that began with the Muslim person and spread out to the family, the town, the community, the city, and so on. What he says is that the axis of the movement in every community is the mosque and the Islamic community center. And what they want to do is have control of the leadership positions. And they've gone about that in a very assiduous, studied way, and I think they've accomplished a lot. And what I think the big problem is that they're not representative in the main of American Muslims. And when the Justice Department turns to the International Institute of Islamic Thought, or MPAC, or CARE, or, you know, you name the alphabet soup, ISNA, many of these organizations, not all of them, but many of them, identified for good evidentiary reasons as unindicted co-conspirators in the Hamas financing case. When the Justice Department turns to them as its go-to people in the Muslim community, what it's doing is giving them the prestige of the government and selling out the pro-American, pro-Western American Muslim. And that's what I think is most objectionable about it.
In addition to that, and just again, because what you focused on in your question, Ken, is how does this translate into practical impact on the people who are supposed to be protecting us? A related point, not involving justice, but one of these trainers, one of our colleagues, as a matter of fact, in the Team B report, Stephen Coughlin, was supposed to be doing a training session, the kind of training that is now being deprogrammed, evidently, at the CIA. And evidently, the Council on American Islamic Relations, one of the unindicted co-conspirators in the Holy Land Foundation trial, as Andy mentioned, issued a press release complaining about this. The matter was taken up, we're told, in the White House, where the decision was made that henceforth only the Department of Homeland Security would be allowed to decide who would do training. And they are being counseled as to who should do the training by an advisory board that helped with this report that Fred mentioned a moment ago, and that is comprised of people from organizations that are on the unindicted co-conspirators list in the Holy Land Foundation trial. And I just have to say, having spent some time in the government myself, the extent to which you have a policy agency at the direction of the White House telling the intelligence community who they can receive information from is a sure way to corrupt the quality of intelligence that the policy community is then going to be relying upon, presumably, to make decisions. So this is a question, and I guess what we're really getting at is just a measure, superficial maybe, but nonetheless a measure of the degree of penetration that has taken place. Did you have something you want to say, Amanda?
I want to add one issue that everybody talks about, these organizations like CARE, ISNA, and the rest of them. They're all representatives. They introduce themselves, and our government accepts the facts as facts that they are representative of American Muslims community. There is
The
no
leaders.
such thing.
The leaders.
They are the leaders, yes. There is no such a thing as one Muslim community in this country. And American Muslims are just as diverse as American Christians are. We come from different countries with different cultures, different historical background, different languages. And many of us don't like each other either. Like, as an Iranian, I don't like Arabs. My history, 1400 years, it's been built into me. So when they say that these people are representatives or the leaders of the American Muslim community, it doesn't exist. Iranian Americans, 2 million, we fled from Islam and Sharia law in Iran. In 1979, there was only 53,000 Iranian Americans. Now there are 2 million. In 30 years, we have all fled. We have not built a mosque. Not a single mosque has been built by the Iranian Americans. Mosques have been built mostly by the Arabs and the Pakistanis. And therefore, like Syrians are not involved in any of these things. So when these people introduce themselves as leader of American Muslim community, that's not non-existent and it's a falsehood.
Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
I wondered if Mendez and Irvin could address a new organization that has emerged. I think she was one of the founders, the American Islamic Leadership Council, which actually published a pretty rigorous critique of the Obama administration's politically correct and unfortunately you say corrupted from a perspective of policy, counterterrorism policy. Can you just tell a little bit about that group? It's the American Islamic Leadership Council?
Yes. Well, since I call American Muslim communities silent majority, because everybody is busy doing their work. They're not involved in politics. Nobody wants to import anything. They're just going after their daily businesses, paying taxes, raising their kids, and so on and so forth, like everybody else. And nobody pays attention. The American Muslims, especially in my community, don't pay any attention to what's happening in America, where what we fled from is now here. And so we have to fight it here. We can't flee from here anywhere else. So we got together, a group of us, and decided that we are going to, this silent majority is no longer will be silent, and we are going to put together a group, a real diverse group, members of each community, leaders in the communities, organizations in different communities, from the Syrians to Iranians to Pakistanis to the ones who don't, and Egyptians. We have from every country membership, and what we do is try to, our policy is protect American, our security, national security, stand for our Constitution, for freedom, equality, and all of those things. And we stand against what Islamism and Muslim Brotherhood is doing in our country here. But unfortunately, we are not getting any attention from the media, because we are on the wrong side of the issues, perhaps. But we try to bring up the issues as much as we can, and we refuse to accept the document that the administration had put out, anti-terrorism. We came up with our own document. We told them what should be done by our government against the Islamism in this country to protect our national security. We have been, we are in process of issuing another press release and document against this blasphemy law that they are being considered. They are talking about it, and it's going to be a very, very dangerous issue that needs to be paid attention to, and we have to watch it carefully and closely, because if this takes over, that would be the end of our democracy.
And thank you. Fred?
I just wanted to pick up on one thing, because both Andy and Frank talked about some of the prominent so-called, in our view, ersatz Muslim leaders that are showing up at places like Georgetown Law School yesterday to preside over these discussions and were involved in the creation of the Homeland Security document. These would include people like Imam Mohammed Majid at the Islamic Society of North America, who is a regular participant in actually these policy discussions, and others. But the other side of that is just as insidious. Those folks that work with people like Manda, who are trying to provide a counter-argument, are actively being dismissed by this administration and the media as well, the most prominent of which is Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, somebody you may know because he has testified in front of Peter King's committee and has spoken out against all of these efforts. But most recently, he has, for the last 15 months, been promoted by Senator Mitch McConnell to join as a commissioner the State Department's U.S. Advisory Commission on Public Diplomacy. And after 15 months of vetting and interviews and the usual rigmarole you have to go through, he's summarily dropped without any explanation whatsoever. Now, I don't know if that is the last gasp there, but this is another gentleman. He's one of the people involved in the American Islamic Leadership Coalition. He has founded the American Islamic Forum on Democracy. But the problem seems to be that these voices are not even given the courtesy of attention by this administration. These are the people who are not invited to the iftar dinners. These are the people that do not show up on these panels, and you have to ask yourself why. If they have a legitimate argument, if they too, as Manda say, represent a diverse population of people who happen to be Muslims who are also American citizens, why is their voice not as important as Nihad Awad's or Imam Majid or any of the other people that are usually coalescing around discussions on Islamophobia?
Terrific point. And we've got a couple more questions. I know we're running late, but I do want to make sure that we make clear one of the things that's relevant here, and that is when you hear people like Salman Mariyadi, I believe it is, from MPAC in the Los Angeles Times yesterday, effectively threatening the government of the United States, that if they do not consult with him or do what he wishes them to do, for example, with respect to this training business, that will rupture the relationship between the Muslim American community and the law enforcement agencies and the government of the United States and so on. This is rubbish. This is the Muslim Brotherhood threat doctrine at work. And while they may not be espousing violence in their own right at the moment, or using it perhaps at the moment, it is still, the threat of it hangs over everything. And I just have to say that when you see the Justice Department cowering in the face of it, not just having these meetings that they sponsor with these guys, but as Manda says, exclusively dealing with them, and now contorting themselves to assure them that we'll do anything we can to satisfy you that we're not training people in ways that you find offensive. You've got the information dominance program fully in play. Yes, sir.
I'd like to direct this question to Mr. McCarthy because of his legal... I'm sorry. I should know better. I was only in broadcasting for 40 years. What do I know about a mic? I'd like to ask you and anybody else on the panel that wants to join in on this topic. There have been reports of so-called honor killings here in the United States where Muslim men have murdered their wives and their daughters. Now, that may be okay with Sharia law as it's practiced overseas, but is there any effort either by officials in the government, which I'm skeptical of, or unofficial efforts, sustained efforts to bring these people to justice on the grounds that in the United States we have laws against murder?
Back in the mid-'90s, when we tried the blind shake, the defense that he wanted to put before the jury was that he couldn't be convicted for what he had done because he was merely carrying out the Sharia mission of the Islamic cleric, which is not just with respect to terrorism, but with respect to any course of conduct, to have the flock, as it were, propose this or that course of conduct, and the imam or the cleric says it's halal or haram, that it is permissible under Islamic law or impermissible. He was not allowed to put that defense before the jury in our case, very simply because everybody in the United States is expected to follow American law, and your personal religious beliefs are not a defense to any sort of crime if it's pursuant to a statute, which all criminal laws are, that is neutral and of universal application. Neutral in the sense that it's not enacted with an animus toward a particular religion, and of universal application in the sense that the law applies to everyone. The law that says you can't make war on the United States doesn't say Muslims can't make war in the United States. It says nobody can. So in 1995, that was not deemed to be a defense. You flash forward to about a year ago in New Jersey, and we have a case where a Muslim man was serially beating and raping the Muslim woman who was trying to divorce him, and a state judge in the state of New Jersey would not give her a protective order because he basically accepted the man's Sharia defense. He said that as he understood his religious tenets, the woman is not permitted to refuse the man under Sharia law, and therefore he would not issue the protective order because in his own mind the man was not raping the woman, even if we might see it differently. Now, happily, that case was reversed on appeal, but my point is that what was laughed out of a courtroom in 1995 as preposterous, to think that you could defend terrorism by saying that you had a religious obligation, was actually not only taken seriously, but one court actually accepted it as a defense claim 15 years later. So to me, that's a mark of real slippage. But in terms of your direct question, I don't think that I'm not a fan of any kind of these hate crimes and bias crimes laws. I sort of think, as a prosecutor, which I was for about 20 years, murder is a crime already. Violent activity is already a crime. You get to prove at trial the motive of why somebody does what they do. In fact, in any case where you have to prove intent, which is every criminal case, and particularly where you have to prove a heightened level of intent, you get to prove why it is that people do what they do. And at sentencing, judges are allowed to take into account all of the facts that are relevant to both the offense conduct and the offender. So to me, it's just an enormous an enormous waste of time and a lot of pandering, frankly, to have these sort of hate crime laws. But the more important point is, nothing in Sharia, or frankly anybody's belief system, now let's not just make it specific to Islam, anybody's belief system is a defense to a criminal offense in the United States. And it's not a mitigating factor, it's not any of that stuff. We oughtn't be entertaining these defenses. We ought to go back to the way things were in 1995, which is that this is America, and you're required to follow American law. If you find yourself in New Jersey, you have to follow New Jersey law. But none of this stuff is a defense or ought to be regarded as one.
A related point on this is that to the extent that you need hate speech to have a hate crime, you can see how this evolves a classic slippery slope to the kind of problem that Manda was just talking about, where you wind up having a country that is beginning to accommodate itself through some administrative direction, or maybe in due course by the courts or by legislation, that says, you know, that First Amendment thing about freedom of expression, well, in fact, there are limits. And the limits increasingly, practically speaking, as we've been talking about today in the context of how the government is dealing with these guys who are endlessly offended by even the truth, is to say, well, we better not speak it. And you will get yourself into trouble if you do speak it. And when we hear Hillary Clinton is now trying to bridge with the Organization of Islamic Cooperation their blasphemy law agenda with our slightly modified First Amendment rights, it's a very worrying thing. And this is why I very much wanted to have Fred on the program, because he's living proof that it has consequences.
Frank, could I just add to that one other point, which is that 5 minutes ago, these are the same people who were telling us that dissent was the highest form of patriotism. Now there seem to be subjects that are off the table, so it's a little bit dizzying to try to keep up with them.
Yes, sir.
About 6 years ago, PBS did a documentary that was a simple one about immigrants to the U.S., and one of the randomly chosen participants turned out to be a Chicago-based Palestinian Islamist activist who, behind his desk, had on his wall a Palestinian flag, and beside that a poster of Che Guevara. And I remember being taken aback by that, and I was reminded of him yesterday when Pamela Geller mentioned him on her website as being part of the Occupy Wall Street protests. I wondered if one of you could comment on the seeming ease with which the far left and the Islamist ideology seems to team up, and how that might affect our ability to check it in the future.
Andy, you've written on this.
Yeah, the subtitle of my Grand Jihad book is How Islam and the Left Sabotage America. And it's always, you always have to preface this by saying, when you're talking about Islam, we're talking about Islamism, people who want to impose Sharia, not all Muslims. And when you're talking about the left, I'm not talking about all left-of-center people, all progressive people. I'm talking about leftists and Islamists who have what I would regard as a totalitarian agenda. Totalitarian in the sense that they really do want to run everything, and authoritarian in the sense that they want it run by a central government. I was quite surprised after the book came out to be asked, do you really think that Islamists and leftists would work together? Because the evidence that they do work together is so clear. I thought the interesting question would be why. For Al-Qaeda, since 9/11, the Center for Constitutional Rights, which is a leftist organization started by Bill Kunstler in the 60s, has been the main lawyer for the enemy combatants down in Guantanamo Bay. As Manda could speak to better than I could, Khomeini and the left, the Iranian left, the communists, colluded together until they drove out the last remnants of anything that was pro-Western, and then they turned on each other, which is what always ends up happening. In Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood actually worked with Nasser until they knocked out the monarchy, and then they turned on each other. And so, look, sometimes the Islamists come on top, sometimes the leftists come on top. They do have very serious differences, particularly in the area of gay rights, women's rights, abortion, and the like. But historically, they have always cooperated when there was a common obstacle or adversary. In the United States, it's our freedom agenda, and frankly, people like us who want to shine a light on it. And the reason that they are able to cooperate in a seemingly seamless way is one of the unspoken and unexamined things about Islamist ideology, which is that it is predominantly a collectivist, redistributionist ideology. So that while there are disputes about a variety of different items that I just mentioned, there's a lot of agreement about having a centralized authority, having an authority that actually runs everything. In Islam, they don't have the same notion of private property as we do. In Islamist ideology, the owner of property actually is Allah, and the nominal owner of it is actually somebody who's sort of holding it in trust for the Islamic community, and the Islamic State can tell them what to do with the property if that's what the Islamic State decides to do. If you look at, for example, the Obamacare campaign, you'll have seen a lot of the Islamist organizations in the United States were front and center promoting Obamacare because it's very much along the lines of their own ideology. And as I think Zuhdi Jasser has pointed out, probably better than anyone, all you need to do is go on Ikhwan Web. Is that what it's called? IkhwanWeb.com? The Muslim Brotherhood's site, which you can get in English language on the internet, has a very left of center, I'd say often extreme left of center economic program. So they do agree on a lot of big ticket items. They have small disagreements, but historically they've always cooperated when there's a common adversary, and thankfully we're it. So I hope they'll be cooperating together for a good long time.
Amanda?
Yes. There is also the history of the Cold War in the Middle East. After the Second World War and the Cold War, the Soviet Union, considering Middle East and the Muslim world their backyards, and United States was a new kid on the block, and they were coming in, and so Soviet Union, communism, their influences and their arms across the Middle East within the Muslim communities was the force anti-Americanism to kick America out of the Middle East. And this has become an issue of sort of brotherhood of socialism or communism and Islamism, because during the Cold War they had the same anti-American goal.
Fred Grandy?
I just say that this is a tactic that to some degree I think the Muslim Brotherhood and their allies have mastered better than just about any threat that has been advanced against the United States, including the Soviet threat. They have mastered the art of public relations, and going back to the explanatory memorandum that was uncovered when the treasure trove of Muslim Brotherhood materials was uncovered in 2004 in Annandale, and Andy talked about it and so did Frank. Number 3 in their 5-step plan is co-opting the media, and they have done a very successful job of that by forming these alliances, temporary though they may be, with the left. But for example, right now, just before I got up here this morning, I was looking at some stuff that I had not gotten to yesterday, and CARE has now come out in favor of the Occupy Wall Street effort and has actually put stuff on their website to that effect. But if you look at who the participants are in this attempt now to brand as Islamophobes and vilify, that includes CARE, MPAC, ISNA, but also the ACLU, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and most importantly, the Center for American Progress, which is a huge left-leaning think tank here in town, presided over by John Podesta, but funded to a large degree by George Soros. Press TV, representing Iranian influences, is involved in that. And if you look at what they're doing, yes, from an Islamic point of view, it is essentially following the operational guidelines of people like Saeed Qutb and Ala Maududi, who kind of created the battle plan for advancing Islam in the 20th century. But it's also chapter and verse out of Saul Alinsky. It is ad hominem attacks on no less a person than Frank or Daniel Pipes, head of the Middle Eastern Policy Forum, or Robert Spencer, and it is also going after people like Zuhdi Jasser as validators. And this is as a matter of fact, they've published a document called Fear Incorporated, which is about 138 pages of ad hominem attacks and almost no argument as to why people like Frank are a threat to society. They're just kind of branding them and then highlighting what their offenses are. So this is a strategy that I think has been used by the left successfully for, gosh, the better part of 100 years. And I think the only reason they're doing it is because it's working so well, at least temporarily.
Well, we could go on and on. I know Andy has got a train to catch, and I suspect others of you have already had more than you bargained for. Let me make just 2 quick points in closing on this very important subject. I happen to believe that the problem we face today with the Muslim Brotherhood's successes in penetrating our government and our civic institutions and using our civil liberties against us is in no small measure a result of their hand-in-glove partnership with the left. As I think each of our panelists have made the point, these people are getting tutored and enabled and empowered by some of the most prominent organizations of the left. I'm appreciative of Amanda's making the point that this has its roots deep in the Cold War. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that the Soviets taught the Muslim Brotherhood and the terrorists more generally of Islam everything they know about this. Now, truthfully, of course, the roots of Sharia and so on far predated Leninism, but in terms of modern influence operations, covert action, penetration, and terrorism, the Soviets wrote the book. And these guys were literally taken to school by them. And I think that the kind of collaboration that we've seen with the left, and Andy's point is well taken, it's not the entire left, but it is the radical left. It is the anti-American left that is deeply involved in trying to help these guys advance their program. And you see it in, among other places. Organizations like the, what do they call themselves? The national, no, the National Coalition, I think it is, for to protect political freedoms, which was run at a time by Sami Al-Arian, now a convicted felon. But Kit Gage, longtime communist running the National, what was it, National Legal Council or Forum, one of the Soviet front groups in the legal community, was its executive director, as I recall. But just to bring it up to the minute, about 2 weekends ago, there was a National Leadership Council meeting convened in Dearborn, Michigan. It brought together some of the organizations that Fred talked about. John Conyers was one of the presenters, the Center for American Progress, the American Civil Liberties Union, and a whole host of Muslim Brotherhood operatives. And, you know, this National Leadership Council is about the business of promoting this agenda, I'm afraid, of weakening the United States to the benefit of its enemies, foreign and domestic. And I will just say, perhaps this is a subject we could delve into on another day with another team if need be, but I'm deeply troubled by the fact that Grover Norquist was one of the people headlining that particular National Leadership Council in Dearborn, Michigan. But suffice it to say, we have a challenge in both understanding and contending with this enemy within. And I appreciate enormously the SAGE Insights Council and authoritative treatment of these issues by the folks on this panel. And I hope you'll join me in thanking them and We'll be talking again about this in the future.